At exactly midnight on October 12, 1893, the lights inside Hollowford Manor went out. The dinner plates were still warm. The candles were still burning. By morning, the entire Halloway family had vanished, without a sound, without a struggle, without a trace. And for over a century, no one has been able to answer one question. Where did they go, and who or what took them? It was the kind of night when the wind seems to speak. October 12, 1893. The rain came down in thin, relentless sheets, tapping against the tall windows of Hollowford Manor like impatient fingers. The lamps along the deserted road swayed in the wind, their light bending and shivering under the weight of the storm. Most of Yorkshire slept, but Hollowford was still awake, dimly, quietly, as though holding its breath. A lone postman trudged up the gravel path, his oilskin coat glistening in the downpour, his boots squelched with every step. In his hand he clutched a single envelope, thick cream-colored paper sealed with dark red wax. There was no return address, only 4 words written in a hurried, almost trembling script. For the last, Halloway. The postman knocked. The sound echoed strangely, as though the walls of the manor swallowed it and whispered it back. Sir Edmund Halloway himself answered the door, a tall man in his late 50s, with a face lined by both authority and fatigue. His eyes, pale blue and slightly unfocused, fell on the letter with a flicker of recognition, or was it dread? He said nothing, only took the envelope, nodded curtly, and closed the door without a word. Inside, the manor was warm, lit by the glow of dozens of candles. Lady Margaret sat in the drawing room with their daughter, Eleanor, and young son, Thomas. A clock ticked steadily above the fireplace, its hands creeping toward midnight. In the dining hall, silver platters gleamed under candlelight. The family's butler, Mr. Graham, was laying out the final touches for a late supper, their tradition on stormy nights. Sir Edmund walked past them all without a glance, carrying the letter into his private study. The room was lined with shelves of leather-bound books, their spines cracked with age. A map of the Yorkshire countryside hung above the desk, dotted with small pins, whose meaning no one outside the family understood. He broke the wax seal with a sharp snap. The letter inside contained only a single sentence, written in the same hurried hand as the envelope. When the clock strikes 12, leave the West Wing. No signature, no explanation. For a moment, Sir Edmund stood frozen. Then, almost instinctively, he locked the study door. His breathing grew shallow. From somewhere deep in the manor, a door creaked, slowly, deliberately. Downstairs, Lady Margaret felt a cold draft. Though all the windows were shut, she shivered and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Did you hear that?" she asked the children. Eleanor nodded, her wide eyes fixed on the shadowed hallway that led toward the West Wing. Thomas tilted his head, listening. "It's like someone's walking upstairs," he whispered. The clock ticked on, its sound suddenly louder, more urgent. Sir Edmund emerged from the study moments later, his face pale but composed. He tucked the letter into his coat pocket and summoned Mr. Graham with a low voice. "Lock every door to the West Wing," he ordered. "No one goes near it tonight. Do you understand?" Mr. Graham hesitated. "Sir, the West Wing is already locked." I said, "Lock again." At 11:47 p.m., the storm reached its peak. The wind screamed through the trees like a living thing. The rain battered the windows so hard it seemed determined to break through. Candles flickered. In the dining hall, the family gathered for their supper. But their usual lively conversation was absent. Every sound, the clink of silverware, the rustle of clothing, felt too loud, like it was being amplified in the silence. Lady Margaret kept glancing at her husband, who stared at the clock as though it were counting down to something inevitable. At exactly 11:59 p.m., the grandfather clock in the main hall let out a deep, resonant chime. First strike. The candle flames stretched unnaturally tall, shadows leaping across the walls. Second strike. Somewhere in the West Wing, a door slammed shut, though no one was there. Third strike. Eleanor gasped, clutching her mother's arm. "There's someone in the hallway," she whispered. Fourth strike. The lights flickered, the rain outside vanishing into a sudden, unnatural silence. Fifth strike. The smell of something damp and earthy filled the air, as though the walls themselves had been opened to the night. By the time the 12th strike echoed through the manor, the entire house was plunged into darkness. What happened between that final chime and the first light of dawn, no one alive can say for certain. All that is known is that when morning came, Hollowford Manor stood eerily silent. The supper table was still set. The food was still warm. The candles still burned faintly, wax pooling on the fine tablecloth. But the Halloway family, Sir Edmund, Lady Margaret, Eleanor, and Thomas, were gone. No note, no footprints, no trace. Only the letter remained, lying open on the dining table, its single warning staring back at the empty chairs. When the clock strikes 12, leave the West Wing. To understand the night, they vanished. You have to understand the family that once ruled Hollowford Manor. The Halloways were not just wealthy, they were known. Their name carried weight in every corner of Yorkshire society. Landowners, industrial investors, patrons of the arts. The Halloways had built their fortune on coal textiles and quiet political influence. For generations, the family lived in the sprawling stone manor atop the Hollowford Hills, overlooking miles of moorland. From that vantage, they could see the village far below, the winding road leading into town, and more importantly, anyone coming toward their estate. It was said Sir Edmund's grandfather had chosen the location for one reason. A man should always see who approaches before they see him. A family of appearances. Sir Edmund Halloway, the last patriarch, was a man bred for control. He had been schooled at Eton, trained in law, and later positioned in quiet but strategic government roles. He rarely raised his voice in public, but behind closed doors his word was law. Lady Margaret, by contrast, had the kind of charm that seemed to belong to a different world. Born Margaret Ashcombe, she was the daughter of a respected but financially struggling noble family. Her marriage to Sir Edmund was considered one of the most advantageous unions of the decade. Wealth for her family, and elevated social grace for his. Their two children, Eleanor and Thomas, had been raised in luxury, but also in secrecy. They were tutored privately, rarely seen at village gatherings. Locals gossiped that the children had odd ways, speaking to themselves, laughing at nothing, staring at people a moment too long. Others claimed they were simply shy, sheltered from the real world. The midnight dinners. The Halloways had one peculiar tradition that made them both admired and whispered about: the midnight dinners. Twice a year, invitations were sent to a select few, never more than 6 guests, to dine at Hollowford at the stroke of midnight. No one knew why this hour was chosen, only that the family insisted on it. The dinners were decadent, with imported wines, rare game meats, and exotic fruits. But guests often left unsettled, unable to name exactly what had made them uncomfortable. One guest, a distant cousin, later wrote in a letter, "They served a dish I had never seen before, and when I asked what it was, Lady Margaret only smiled and said, 'It is for those who stay until the end.'" I could not tell if she was joking. The West Wing. The West Wing of Hollowford Manor was older than the rest of the estate. Its stone walls were darker, its ceilings lower, its air colder. Even in summer, a chill lingered there. Servants avoided it whenever possible, claiming it smelled of damp earth and something faintly metallic. It had been sealed in Sir Edmund's childhood after his younger brother, Charles, died under unexplained circumstances. Officially, the boy had fallen ill. Unofficially, whispers told of screaming heard in the night, and of the boy's body being carried out not to the family crypt, but somewhere beyond the moors. Sir Edmund never spoke of Charles again, but he never allowed the West Wing to be demolished. "Some things," he told the steward once, "are better left where they are." Reputation in the village. To the villagers below, the Halloways were a mixture of awe and unease. They brought work to the town, coal mining jobs, textile mills, charitable donations to the church. But they also brought fear. It was said that those who crossed the Halloways rarely prospered afterward. One farmer lost his land after refusing to sell. Another man who publicly insulted Sir Edmund was found days later in his own field, dazed, unable to speak, and with no memory of what had happened. Psychologists today might call it social dominance conditioning, a calculated shaping of perception where respect is fed by just enough fear to ensure obedience. Signs before the fall. In the months leading to their disappearance, subtle changes crept into the manor's routines. Servants noticed Sir Edmund staying awake until dawn, walking the halls with a candle, muttering to himself. Lady Margaret stopped attending charity events, instead keeping the children indoors even on sunny days. The family's priest, Father Bellamy, was called to the manor more frequently. In one visit, he was overheard saying to Sir Edmund, "If you keep ignoring the signs, you'll have no one to blame but yourself." 2 weeks before October 12th, the family dismissed nearly half the staff. The reason given was economy. The remaining servants worked in tense silence. At night, some claimed to hear pacing in the locked west wing, slow and steady, as though someone were counting the steps. A house that watched. If you spoke to anyone who had been inside Hollowford, they would tell you the same thing. The house watched. The narrow windows seemed to follow you. The portraits lining the halls, especially of past Halloway patriarchs, had eyes that caught the candlelight in ways that made them appear alive. One maid, who left the manor just days before the disappearance, later said, "I would be sweeping the main hall, and I could swear I heard breathing behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing. Only that long hallway to the west wing, black as pitch." The letters wait. When Sir Edmund received the midnight letter on the night they vanished, it wasn't the first time a mysterious message had arrived. 6 years earlier, a similar envelope had been delivered during a midnight dinner. That letter, too, bore no signature, only the words, "Do not open the west wing tonight." No one knew what prompted it, but the dinner ended abruptly, and for the next month the family kept entirely to the east side of the house. It raises the question, did Sir Edmund already know what was coming on October 12th? And if he did, why didn't he leave? Foreshadowing the vanishing. Looking back now, the signs were everywhere. But hindsight is always cruel. The final week before that storm, the children were seen in the village for the first time in months. Eleanor stood in the general store staring at a display of candles, and when the shopkeeper asked what she was looking for, she whispered, "Light won't help when it's their time." That same day, Thomas was found in the churchyard, placing small stones in a perfect circle around an unmarked grave. Locals chalked it up to the strange habits of wealthy children. They didn't realize they were watching a countdown. By the time the clock struck midnight on October 12th, the Halloway name, centuries of wealth, power, and fear, was about to become nothing more than a whisper. And all anyone would have left was a locked west wing, and the question of who or what had been waiting inside it all along. The storm that swallowed Hollowford Manor on October 12th did not come without warning. It had been building not just in the skies, but in the air inside the manor itself. The weeks before their disappearance were like the breath before a scream, stretched and trembling, waiting for something to shatter. The servant who left 3 weeks before that night, a young maid named Clara Simmons, left Hollowford abruptly. She arrived in the village pale, shaking, clutching a small suitcase as though afraid it might be taken from her. When the innkeeper's wife asked why she had left such a prestigious position, Clara only said, "The children talk to someone who isn't there, and sometimes I think they answer back." She refused to elaborate, but she told the vicar in private that she had been dusting the upstairs hallway when she heard Eleanor humming a lullaby Clara's own mother had sung to her as a child, one no one else could have known. When Clara entered the room, Eleanor was alone, but the bed's canopy had been pulled down, as though hiding someone. Locked doors and new keys. Sir Edmund began locking parts of the manor at strange hours. Rooms that had been open for decades were suddenly off-limits. The pantry was bolted shut after sunset. Even the library, once his pride, was locked during the day. Mr. Graham, the butler, was given a new set of keys, heavier than before, each one labeled with small tags. Some of the tags bore symbols instead of words: a crescent moon, a circle with a cross, an hourglass. When Graham asked about them, Sir Edmund replied, "Not everything in this house can be labeled in words." Whispers in the West Wing. Though sealed, the West Wing made its presence felt. On windy nights, the sound of footsteps drifted from behind its locked doors, slow, deliberate, and always stopping when someone approached. Lady Margaret began avoiding that part of the manor entirely. The few times she had to pass its hallway, she would clutch her shawl tightly and keep her eyes fixed on the floor. Once, Thomas was found sitting cross-legged in front of the locked West Wing door, tapping the wood rhythmically with his knuckles. When his mother asked what he was doing, he smiled and said, "Counting so they know when to open." The clock that ran backwards. In early October, the manor's grandfather clock, the same one that would chime 12 on the night they vanished, began behaving oddly. On 2 separate occasions, Mr. Graham swore he saw the hands move backwards, as though time itself was being wound in reverse. Each time it happened, the house would grow unusually cold, and the air would smell faintly of smoke. A watchmaker from the village was called to inspect it, but when he arrived, the clock ticked perfectly, without flaw. As he left, he told Mr. Graham, "It's not the clock that's wrong, it's the house." A priest visit. Father Bellamy came to the manor twice in the final week, each visit longer than the last. No one knew exactly what was discussed, but the servants overheard fragments, words like binding, trespass, and the hour. On his final visit, he left looking ashen, telling Sir Edmund, "If you will not leave, at least prepare them for what's coming." That night, Lady Margaret wept in her bedroom, her sobs muffled through the heavy oak door. The children's game. For days before the storm, Eleanor and Thomas began playing a game in the drawing room. They called it Midnight Steps. The rules were simple. One person stood facing the wall. The other would take 12 steps forward when the clock chimed midnight. If the wall player turned around before the 12th step, the game ended. But the servants noticed something chilling. When the children played, they didn't stop at 12. They kept walking, their footsteps echoing long after they should have reached the wall. And sometimes they would speak in low voices, as if responding to someone standing right in front of them. The silence in the walls. The closer it came to October 12th, the quieter the manor became. Conversations were shorter. Meals were taken in silence. Even the servants moved with a kind of subdued caution, as though loud noise might draw attention from something better left asleep. One evening, while delivering tea to the library, Graham thought he heard a faint scratching inside the walls. Not rats, not insects, but deliberate measured strokes, as though someone was writing with a quill on paper embedded within plaster. When he pressed his ear closer, the sound stopped. The storm approaches. By the morning of October 12th, the sky over Yorkshire had turned an unnatural shade, a deep bruised purple with veins of green. The air was heavy electric and tasted faintly metallic. Birds were absent from the gardens. The dogs refused to enter the manor. That afternoon, Sir Edmund was seen standing at the highest window, staring toward the moors. When Mr. Graham asked if he was looking for someone, Sir Edmund replied without turning his head, "They're already here. The letter arrives." And so, as the night closed in and the storm broke over Hollowford, the letter came, carried by a drenched, exhausted postman. The seal cracked under Sir Edmund's thumb, revealing those fatal words. When the clock strikes 12, leave the West Wing. The family gathered for supper. The clock ticked down, and the shadows in Hollowford stretched longer than they ever had before. By morning, the Halloways would be gone. The wind clawed at Hollowford Manor long before midnight. It screamed through the chimneys, rattled the shutters, and made the old oak beams groan as though the house itself were bracing for something it knew was coming. The air was thick with the scent of rain and iron. Inside, the Halloways prepared for their final meal. The table is set. At exactly 11 o'clock, Mr. Graham oversaw the laying of the dining table. A white linen cloth, embroidered with the family crest, was spread perfectly across the polished oak. The silver was placed in exact alignment, each fork, knife, and spoon reflecting the dim flicker of the candelabras. The wine glasses, crystal and impossibly delicate, were set at precise angles. Lady Margaret inspected all with silent intensity. Her fingers trailed over the silverware as if memorizing the feel of it. She did not speak but once when her hand paused on the head of the table. Her lips moved soundlessly, mouthing something like a prayer. A quiet meal for four. It was unusual for the Halloways to dine without guests, but tonight only the family sat down. The storm had cut off the road. No one could have reached the manor, even if invited. Sir Edmund took his seat at the head of the table, his face calm but rigid. Lady Margaret sat opposite, her eyes darting now and then toward the darkened hallway that led to the west wing. Eleanor and Thomas sat side by side, unusually still. They did not fidget or whisper to each other as they normally did. They simply watched the candles burn lower. The first course, soup, was served, a rich consommé, steaming in the chill air. The clink of spoons against porcelain was the only sound, apart from the wind's howl. Halfway through, Thomas set his spoon down and whispered, "It's louder tonight." Lady Margaret froze. "What is, darling?" He tilted his head toward the west wing, the walking. A muscle in Sir Edmund's jaw twitched, but he said nothing. The soup was cleared in silence. The letter returns. The envelope that had arrived earlier now lay beside Sir Edmund's plate, its seal broken, but its contents still inside. He had read it once, then returned it to the envelope, as though doing so could contain the words. Lady Margaret reached for it, but Sir Edmund's hand covered hers. "Not now," he murmured. "It will be midnight soon enough." Second course, the roast. The storm struck harder. Rain hammered the windows, and thunder rolled over the moors like the slow turning of a great wheel. The roast, pheasant with rosemary, was brought in. The scent was rich, almost too rich, and seemed to cling to the air instead of dissipating. Eleanor stared at it without eating, her fork resting useless in her hand. Sir Edmund finally broke the silence. "You've both been very quiet tonight." Eleanor's eyes flicked to him. "We're listening." "To what?" "To the man in the hallway." The knife slipped in Lady Margaret's hand, and the blade nicked her finger. A bead of blood welled, bright in the candlelight. She pressed her napkin to it and did not speak. The grandfather clock. From the corner of the room, the great-grandfather clock loomed, its face glowing faintly in the flicker of the candles. It ticked on, steady, relentless. At 11:45, the ticking grew louder, or perhaps the room had grown quieter. The sound seemed to fill the air, seeping into the bones of the house, and with each tick the storm outside seemed to fall into rhythm. An unwelcome sound. It began as a faint creak, almost masked by the storm, the sound of a door opening somewhere deep in the manor. Mr. Graham excused himself to investigate, but Sir Edmund's voice stopped him cold. "Leave it." "But, sir?" "Leave it." The door, wherever it was, shut again with a low thud. The final course. Dessert was brought, poached pears and spiced wine. None of them ate. The children sat perfectly still, their eyes unfocused, as though listening to something only they could hear. Lady Margaret reached for her wine glass, her hand trembling. "Edmund, we can't pretend anymore. Not tonight." Sir Edmund's gaze hardened. "We agreed we would face it together. And if facing it means—" She stopped herself, swallowing the words. 5 minutes to midnight. The candles were burning low. Their wax dripped in thick rivulets down the holders, pooling on the white linen. The storm roared outside, rattling the very foundations of the manor. Eleanor suddenly smiled, a small, strange smile. "They're at the door now." Thomas turned his head toward the west wing and nodded, as if confirming her words. The last warning. Sir Edmund picked up the envelope, sliding the letter free. His eyes scanned the words again. "When the clock strikes 12, leave the west wing." He folded it and placed it back down, his fingers lingering on the paper. "We will not run from this house," he said quietly. Midnight. The grandfather clock began its chime. 1. The air in the room thickened, as if the walls had drawn closer. 2. The candle flames bent, though there was no draft. 3. A sound came from the west wing, not footsteps now, but a dragging, slow, and deliberate. 4. Lady Margaret's hand found Eleanor's under the table. 5. Thomas began to count under his breath. 6. A smell seeped into the room, earth damp and fresh, like a grave just opened. 7. The dragging sound was closer. 8. Sir Edmund rose from his chair. 9. The storm outside stopped, completely. 10. A faint knock on the dining room door. 11. Every candle went out. 12. The after. No one saw what entered the dining room, but the servants, hiding in the kitchen, later swore they heard for distinct chairs scrape back from the table. Then nothing, not a word, not a footstep, just the sound of the dining room door swinging slowly shut. When they dared to enter, the room was empty. The plates were still warm. The wine still swirled in the glasses. The grandfather clock ticked on, but its hands had stopped, frozen forever at 12. The west wing door, locked for decades, now stood ajar. A trail of wet footprints led inside, but no footprints ever came out. The dining room was still warm. The pheasant lay untouched on silver platters, steam curling lazily in the candle stubs that had burned themselves to pools of wax. The clock ticked soundlessly now, the weight of its frozen hands pressing down on the air. Mr. Graham stood in the doorway, his breathing ragged, the hair on his arms rising with the kind of dread that makes the body colder than any winter wind. Behind him, the remaining servants huddled, their eyes darting from shadow to shadow as if something might step forward from them at any moment. He had not heard the family leave. No doors had opened. No footsteps had rushed past. One moment they were there, seated in that heavy silence, the storm raging outside. The next, only the hum of emptiness remained. The west wing door, that ancient portal sealed for longer than Graham had worked in the manor, now stood ajar. It gaped into a blackness so complete that it seemed not merely an absence of light, but the presence of something far older and more patient. The air drifting from it was wrong, cold, yes, but also faintly sweet, like flowers left to rot in a locked room. He took one step forward, then another, his hand brushing the wall as if he could steady himself against its solidity. It felt damp, almost breathing. Behind him, Mary, the kitchen maid, whispered, "Don't go in there, Mr. Graham. Not after what we've heard." Graham did not answer. The west wing had been locked for decades, and every servant who had lasted longer than a season in Hollowford knew the stories, the deaths, the renovations that had been started and abruptly abandoned, the strange noises at night. But never had the door stood open on its own. He pushed it wider. The hinges groaned, like something waking from a long sleep. A rush of stale air brushed past him, carrying with it the faintest trace of something like burning paper. The hallway stretched into blackness, the flicker of the dining room light reaching only a few feet before it was swallowed whole. The wallpaper here was different, faded, water-stained, and peeling in places to reveal wooden boards beneath. The floor was covered in a carpet so old and threadbare it seemed more like shadow than fabric. Each step he took was muffled, as though the house itself did not wish his presence announced. The others hesitated in the dining room doorway, unwilling to follow. But when Graham glanced back, Mary had stepped forward despite herself, her hands gripping the edge of her apron so tightly her knuckles whitened. "I can't let you go alone," she said, though her voice trembled. The hallway led to a grand staircase that curved upward into the dark. Here, the air grew colder still, and the silence pressed closer. Graham thought he heard a faint drip, water, perhaps, from somewhere above, but when he paused, the sound stopped, replaced by something else, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard directly overhead. Mary gasped, clutching his sleeve. "They're still here," she whispered. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to think that somewhere beyond these walls, the Halloways had simply retreated. But the memory of that frozen clock hand and those vanishing footsteps gnawed at the edges of reason. They climbed the stairs slowly, each step complaining beneath their weight. At the top, A long corridor stretched out before them, lined with doors on both sides. Some hung ajar, others shut tight, their keyholes like small, watching eyes. The carpet here was thicker, and their footsteps seemed to sink into it unnaturally. They tried the first door. It opened into what must once have been a bedroom, though the bed was little more than a frame covered in a shroud of dust. The curtains hung heavy and damp, and the wallpaper was stained in irregular shapes, almost, Graham thought, like handprints. Mary refused to step inside. "It smells wrong," she said, and he realized she was right. The faint scent of turned earth lingered here, like a grave recently disturbed. They moved on. The second room was smaller, perhaps a study. A desk sat in the center, its drawers half open, papers scattered across the floor as though someone had left in great haste. But the papers themselves were strange. The ink faded to brown, the edges curling, yet still damp to the touch, as though written only moments ago. On one, Graham saw a single line written over and over again in a cramped, hurried hand. "When the hour comes, do not look at its face." He folded the paper without telling Mary. Further down, a third door stood ajar, swaying gently as though it had only just been opened. Graham pushed it wider to reveal a nursery. The wallpaper here was brighter, or had once been, covered in faded patterns of moons and stars. A rocking horse stood in the center, its painted eyes wide and wet-looking in the dim light. The air was heavy, warmer than the hallway, and faintly humming. Mary stepped closer to the rocking horse. "Do you hear it?" she asked. He listened. At first he thought it was the wind, but the sound was too regular, too deliberate. It was a lullaby, hummed softly without breath. And then, without warning, the rocking horse began to move back and forth, though no hand touched it. Mary stumbled back with a small cry, bumping into the doorframe. The lullaby stopped. They shut the nursery door and moved on. The corridor bent slightly, leading to a pair of double doors at the very end. They were taller than the others, carved with strange, looping patterns that seemed almost to writhe in the flickering candlelight. Graham felt a pressure in his ears now, as though the air itself were growing thicker the closer they drew to this point. Mary hesitated. "We shouldn't," she said. "We've seen enough." But something in Graham, whether duty, curiosity, or a deeper, darker pull, urged him forward. He placed both hands on the doors and pushed. The room beyond was vast, easily as large as the dining hall below. Its walls were lined with tall shelves, but not with books, with boxes. Hundreds of them, each one small, identical, and unmarked except for a thin strip of black ribbon tied around its center. They were stacked with impossible precision, each equidistant from the others, the entire room smelling faintly of lavender and dust. In the center of the room stood a table. Upon it sat 4 chairs, and on each chair, resting neatly, was a single item of clothing: Sir Edmund's dinner jacket, Lady Margaret's shawl, Eleanor's ribbon, and Thomas's small pair of leather shoes. Mary covered her mouth. "Oh, God." Then came a sound, faint at first, like wind through distant halls, then louder, closer. Footsteps. They came from all directions at once, slow and deliberate, pressing into the heavy silence. Graham's candle flickered violently, and shadows stretched long across the floor, bending toward the center of the room. Mary grabbed his arm. "We have to leave." But the footsteps grew faster now, circling them. The air was colder than any winter night, the lavender scent sharpening into something bitter. And then, from between the shelves, something began to emerge. Not a figure exactly, but an outline, a suggestion of form, darker than shadow and moving with the sound of rustling cloth. Graham turned, dragging Mary toward the door, but it had swung shut behind them. His hand scrabbled at the handle, cold as ice, but it would not turn. Behind them, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a voice, or something like a voice, spoke from the darkness. He shouldn't have come here. The candle went out. When Graham opened his eyes again, he was standing alone in the dining room, the table still set for 4, the food still warm. Mary was gone. The west wing door was closed, the keyhole dark. He never spoke of what he saw in that room, not to the constable, not to the vicar, not even to himself in the quiet of his own thoughts. But sometimes, late at night, when the manor was silent and the air tasted faintly of lavender, he would think he heard small leather shoes on the stairs, slow, deliberate, counting all the way to 12. Morning came reluctantly to Hollowford. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained a sheet of unbroken gray, heavy and low, pressing down on the village and the manor alike. Mist curled along the hedgerows, clinging to the trees and pale, shifting veils. The bells from St. Bartholomew's tolled once, long and hollow, their sound swallowed by the damp air. By 9 o'clock, word had spread. The baker's wife told the miller's apprentice, who told the stable boy, who ran the length of High Street, shouting the news. The Halloways are gone, vanished. By noon, the constable's small office was crowded with villagers, some curious, some frightened, some already clutching crosses and muttering prayers. Constable Harris stood behind his desk, a stout man with a red face that grew redder still as each new rumor spilled from trembling lips. He listened, jotted down notes, then pushed past them all with his coat half-buttoned, a lantern in one hand and his walking stick in the other. When Harris reached Hollowford Manor, the great doors stood closed, but unlocked. Inside, he found Mr. Graham seated stiffly in the drawing-room, his hands folded too tightly, his eyes avoiding the west wing corridor. "You're saying you saw them last at supper?" Harris asked. "Yes." "And then they were simply gone?" "Yes." Harris frowned. "And the maid, Mary? She's missing too." A pause. "She followed me into the west wing. I don't remember what happened after that." Harris's eyes narrowed. "You don't remember or you won't say?" Graham's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. "It's the same thing, sir." By mid-afternoon, Harris had gathered a party of 6 men, 2 farmers, a carpenter, the vicar, and his own nephew, who carried a shotgun that shook slightly in his hands. They set out from the manor with ropes, lanterns, and an old map of the estate grounds. The mist clung to them like damp cloth, muffling their voices. Inside the manor, they moved from room to room. The dining table was exactly as Graham had described, plates still warm to the touch, though the hearth had long since gone cold. In the study, Harris found the wax-sealed envelope still lying on the desk. He turned it over, read the words, "To the last Halloway," and tucked it carefully into his coat. They avoided the west wing at first. Something in the air seemed to thicken as they drew near it, the cold pressing against their skin like damp fingers. It was the vicar, pale but resolute, who finally spoke. "If there is something in there, it will not vanish because we refuse to look at it." So they opened the door. The smell was stronger now. Lavender turned sour. The corridor stretched ahead, swallowing the lantern light. They moved slowly, their boots silent on the threadbare carpet, the shadows bending strangely against the walls. At the base of the grand staircase, Harris noticed something the others missed, a smear of mud on the lowest step, as though from a boot, but shaped wrong, narrower, the heel strangely pointed. He crouched, touched it, then wiped his fingers clean without a word. The search party fanned out along the upper corridor, calling names that went unanswered. They opened each door, the dust-shrouded bedroom, the paper-strewn study, the nursery with its rocking horse frozen mid-motion. It was the carpenter who noticed a hum, faint, rhythmic, almost like breathing. It came from the end of the corridor, from the double doors carved with twisting shapes. Harris felt the hair rise on his neck as he approached, the vicar whispering a prayer under his breath. The doors opened without protest. The box room lay exactly as Graham had described, shelves upon shelves of identical parcels, each bound with a black ribbon. The air was cold, the lavender smell sharp enough to sting the nose. On the central table, the 4 items of clothing still rested neatly in their chairs. One of the farmers, a man named Callow, stepped forward and reached for Thomas's shoes. Harris caught his wrist. "Don't touch anything." Callow swallowed and nodded. They searched the shelves, opening one box at random. Inside was a small brass key, tarnished but warm to the touch. Another box held a lock of hair, tied with blue thread. Another contained a child's drawing of a house with no windows. "Whose things are these?" the vicar asked softly. No one answered. The carpenter, lantern raised high, froze mid-step. "There's something written here," he said, pointing to the far wall. They crowded closer. The words were faint, scratched into the plaster in a jagged hand. "We leave at 12. Beneath it, the faint outline of a handprint, pressed deep into the wall, as though it had sunk into something soft. Then the air shifted. The lantern flames thinned, stretching upward. Harris felt a pressure against his chest, like being pushed backward, without hands. From somewhere behind the shelves came the sound of a single footstep. Slow, deliberate. "Out," Harris said, his voice low but urgent. "Now." They retreated quickly, but the sound followed. Step, 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 the echo of it, bending strangely in the long corridor. By the time they reached the top of the grand staircase, the sound had stopped. Outside, the mist had thickened into a pale wall. The men descended the manor steps in silence, the shotgun trembling more noticeably now in the nephew's grip. Harris turned back, once before closing the great doors. In the window above the west wing, he thought he saw a figure, tall, unmoving, watching. But when he blinked, it was gone. The party returned to the village, each man quieter than when he had left. Harris locked the letter in his desk, ordered the manor door sealed, and told the gathered villagers only that the Halloways were gone and the matter required further investigation. But that night, in the snug of the Fox and Hound public house, the whispers began. Some claimed the Halloways had run from debts. Others swore the manor had always been cursed, that its foundation stones were laid on an old ruin no one dared speak of. By midnight, the story had shifted again. The Halloways had been taken, not by men, but by the house itself. The next morning, Harris awoke to find a parcel on his doorstep. It was small, unmarked, tied with a thin strip of black ribbon. Inside was the key from the box room, and a note in a hurried, unfamiliar hand. "When the hour comes, do not look at its face." The key was warm. The fog lingered for 3 days. It lay low along the cobblestones, coiling in the alleys, creeping up the steps of the cottages until the door frame seemed to float in a pale, shifting sea. The sun, when it appeared at all, was little more than a faint disk behind the clouds, casting no warmth. In Hollowford, people began locking their doors before dusk. Curtains were drawn tight, lamps kept low. The sound of the church bell, which once marked the hours, fell silent after the sexton refused to climb the tower. "There's something in the belfry," he muttered, and would say no more. Constable Harris had doubled his rounds, but even his boots on the cobbles sounded subdued, swallowed by the mist. Each night he passed the Fox and Hound, and each night the voices inside stopped as he neared the door. The villagers no longer looked him directly in the eye. In the bakery, Mrs. Kemp would serve him bread without speaking, sliding the loaf across the counter without lifting her gaze. At the post office, the clerk refused to handle the letter Harris had taken from the manor, even when it was sealed inside his coat. "It hums," the man said flatly, "and I don't want to know why." Rumors grew like mold in the damp. Some said the Halloways had returned at night, that a farmer drunk on cider had seen them walking the high road toward the moors, their faces pale and blank, their clothes still marked with the meal they'd last eaten. Others whispered of voices in the hedgerows, speaking in tones that rose and fell like the tide, though no words could be made out. The vicar tried to hold an evening service for peace of mind, but only 6 parishioners came. The rest stayed home, claiming illness, though candles burned in their windows long into the night. On the 5th day, 2 men arrived from Market Hollow, a journalist named Callister, thin and sharp-eyed, and his photographer, a taciturn fellow known only as Briggs. They came with notebooks, cameras, and the brisk assurance of men who believed they'd seen everything. Callister questioned Harris in the small, dim office, his pen scratching across the page. "Vanished, you say?" "All 4 of them, and the servant girl. No sign of forced entry. No ransom note. Nothing taken." "Nothing taken," Harris confirmed, "except themselves." Callister smiled faintly, as if amused by Harris's phrasing. "And you're sure they didn't simply leave? Carriage, train, that sort of thing?" Harris leaned back in his chair. "When you walk the West Wing, you'll stop asking that." By afternoon, Harris, Callister, and Briggs stood before the manor gates. The mist pooled thickest here, as though reluctant to let them pass. Briggs set up his camera, but the lens fogged instantly. He wiped it clean, tried again, same result. "Funny," Briggs murmured. "Doesn't happen anywhere else in the village." Inside, the air was colder. The dust seemed disturbed, though Harris had locked the place himself after the last search. Footprints, bare, faint, led from the front hall toward the West Wing. Callister bent low to examine them, his pen pausing mid-word. "These are fresh." They followed the trail into the box room. The 4 chairs were still there, but now the clothes were gone. In their place, 4 parcels sat neatly, each tied with black ribbon. Briggs hesitated before taking a photograph. The flash lit the room for an instant, and in that brief glare Harris thought he saw, in the far corner, something tall and thin, bent at the shoulders. But when the light faded, the corner was empty. Callister untied 1 ribbon. Inside was a folded piece of paper, on which was drawn a crude outline of Hollowford itself, the church, the square, the cluster of cottages. Over it, a red circle marked the heart of the village. That night, Callister and Briggs took rooms at the Fox and Hound. Harris warned them to lock their doors and keep the lamps lit, but they laughed it off. "We've stayed in worse," Callister said. The following morning, their room was empty. Their beds had not been slept in. On the table lay 2 more black ribbon parcels. One contained Callister's notebook, every page blank. The other held Briggs's camera. The glass cracked clean through. Panic took root. The black ribbon parcels began appearing at other doorsteps, the butcher's, the vicar's, even the schoolhouse. Some contained old keys, others single gloves, others still small mirrors that showed a face behind your own if you looked too long. By the end of the week, no one ventured out after dark. The market stalls closed early. The pub shuttered entirely. The village green, once full of children's voices, lay silent beneath the mist. On the 8th day, Harris found a parcel on his own doorstep. Inside was the brass key he had returned to the manor, and a note, the same hand as before. "It is not the house that keeps them. It is the hour." That night, the church bell rang once at midnight. No one had touched it. The next morning, Mrs. Kemp was gone. Her shop stood open, the bread half kneaded on the table, her apron still on the hook. On the counter, wrapped in black ribbon, was a still warm loaf, and beneath it, a folded scrap of paper bearing 3 words. "We leave tonight." The fear was no longer whispered. It was visible in every face, every movement. Parents kept their children indoors. The constable's rounds grew shorter, his lantern dimmer. People began to speak of leaving Hollowford altogether, but few dared to try. The mist was said to follow you beyond the moors, and no one who left had yet sent word back. One evening, the vicar stood in the square and declared aloud that the village would not be held hostage by superstition. He would go to the manor himself at midnight, he said, and ring the church bell to prove no harm could come from the hour. At 5 minutes to midnight, the square was empty. No one came to watch. At 1 minute past, the bell tolled once, then stopped. The vicar was never seen again. By now, even Harris kept his shutters closed at night. But the black ribbon parcels kept appearing. Sometimes they were left inside locked rooms. Sometimes they arrived without any sound at all. And always there was something inside that belonged to you, or would soon enough. Hollowford was no longer a place where people lived. It had become a place where people waited for the hour. On the 12th day after the Halloways vanished, a stranger arrived in Hollowford. She came in a dark motor car, the kind that looked like it had been polished until it drank in the light. The driver, a thin man in a stiff cap, did not step out when they stopped in the square. The passenger door opened, and a woman in a long wool coat and black gloves stepped onto the cobblestones. She was not dressed like a villager. The coat was cut for the city, the gloves soft leather, her hat wide-brimmed to shadow the sharp angles of her face. She carried no suitcase, only a single leather satchel buckled shut. Constable Harris, watching from his office window, knew before she reached the door that she wasn't here for idle curiosity. She introduced herself simply. Margaret Vale, private inquiry agent. The words sat oddly in the air, as though the room wasn't sure what to do with them. I understand, she continued, that 5 people have gone missing from this village in the last fortnight, and that you've been less than forthcoming with those outside your parish. Harris studied her. Where'd you hear that? From the man who sent me. And who's that? Margaret set the satchel on the desk and unbuckled it. Inside was a stack of papers neatly tied with twine, and atop them a sepia photograph. The Halloway family, standing on the manor steps. Margaret's gloved finger tapped the image of the eldest daughter, Clara. My sister. Harris leaned back, exhaling slowly. You'd better sit down. Margaret did not. She moved instead to the window, her eyes scanning the square. I'll need to see the house. You'll need more than that, Harris said. You'll need to understand what you're walking into. Then tell me. For the next half hour, Harris laid it out. The supper table, the west wing, the box room, the parcels, the outsiders who had come and not left. He spoke of the mist, the bell, the hour. Margaret listened without a single interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she closed the satchel. Show me. The motor car took them as far as the manor gates. The mist was thicker here, rolling across the gravel like a tide. Margaret stood still for a long moment, as though listening. Then she stepped forward, her boots crunching on the damp stones. Inside the manor, she moved deliberately, pausing at each doorway as though committing its dimensions to memory. In the dining room, she touched the tablecloth, then the chair where Clara had sat. In the west wing corridor, she stopped and glanced back at Harris. The air changes here. Harris nodded. You feel too. In the box room, Margaret did not approach the shelves. Instead, she moved to the center of the room, removed one glove, and placed her bare hand on the floorboards. They're warm, she murmured. Harris frowned. It's freezing in here. Margaret put her glove back on. I didn't say the air was warm. That night, she refused Harris's offer of a room at the Fox and Hound. I'll stay here, she said, meaning the manor. That's not wise. I've come for my sister, Constable, not for your approval. She made her camp in the study, lighting a single lamp and laying out papers across the desk. Harris, before leaving, saw sketches of the manor grounds, timelines of the disappearances, even a small folded map marked with red ink at each place a parcel had been found. At midnight, the bell tolled once. Margaret did not move from her chair. The following morning, Harris returned expecting to find the study empty. Instead, Margaret was still there, awake, her lamp unburned, and her papers precisely as she'd left them. You didn't sleep? Harris asked. There was knocking at the windows, she said, but I don't believe it was meant for me. Over the next 2 days, Margaret moved methodically through the village. She questioned the vicar's wife, the butcher's apprentice, the baker's boy. She asked what the parcels had contained, where they had been found, what hour they had appeared. She began carrying one of the black ribbon parcels with her, a small lockbox. When Harris asked what was inside, she said only something that belongs to Clara. On the 3rd night, Margaret came to Harris's office with a request. You keep the manor locked after dark, she said. I want the key. I can't give you that. I'm going in at midnight, whether I have it or not. Harris studied her for a long moment, then set the key on the desk. If you hear it behind you, don't turn around. The fog was so thick it clung to her coat as she approached the manor. Inside, she walked directly to the west wing, her lamp casting a circle of pale light. In the box room, the shelves seemed different, fewer boxes, more space between them. The central table was bare. From the far end of the room came a sound, soft but deliberate. Not footsteps this time, breathing. Slow, steady. Margaret set the locked parcel on the table. "I'm here for Clara," she said into the shadows. "You know who I am." The breathing paused, then very slowly it drew closer. At exactly midnight, the bell tolled once. The breathing stopped. In the silence that followed, Margaret picked up the parcel and turned to leave. The air behind her pressed inward, a weight without shape. She did not look back. When she stepped into the corridor, she found Harris waiting at the far end, lantern in hand. "Well," he asked. Margaret brushed past him. "She's still here, but she's not where you've been looking." Margaret Vale did not leave the manor the next day. Instead, she sat in the study, her notes spread out in careful order, a clock ticking on the desk beside her. The ticking was deliberate, constant, its sound filling the room like a second heartbeat. Constable Harris arrived before noon. "You've not slept again," he said. Margaret ignored the remark. She tapped the clock face. "The hour," she said, "isn't fixed." Harris frowned. "It's always midnight." "No, it's always when they want to be." She showed him her notes, times recorded for each disappearance, each toll of the bell. Not all were exactly 12 o'clock. Some came minutes before, others after. The only constant was that the toll happened when the victim was alone. "They're not tied to time," Margaret said. "They're tied to isolation." Harris shifted uneasily. "And your plan?" "To be alone," she said. That evening, Margaret moved a chair into the West Wing corridor. She sat facing the box room door, lamp beside her, the locked parcel in her lap. Harris stood at the far end of the hall, just out of the lamp's light. Hours passed. The air grew colder. The mist inside the manor thickened until it clung to the walls. The lamp flame wavered. Then, without warning, the bell tolled. Once. Harris's voice came sharp. "It's too early." Margaret didn't answer. From the box room came a faint scratching, not on the floor, on the walls. It moved in slow circles, like something searching for seam. Margaret stood, the parcel still in her arms, and stepped into the room. The shelves were bare, every box gone. In their place, the walls themselves seemed to have shifted, the angles wrong, as if the room had been built to confuse. She set the parcel on the floor and knelt beside it. "Clara," she said, her voice low, "you're going to follow my voice now." The scratching stopped. Something tapped on the parcel. Once, twice, 3 times. Margaret reached for the lock, and the lamp went out. Harris shouted her name. His boots hammered the floor as he ran toward the door, but when he reached it, the corridor beyond was gone. The doorway now opened onto a darkness so deep it swallowed the lantern's glow. "Margaret," he bellowed. From the dark came a whisper. Not her voice. Inside, Margaret could hear Harris calling, but his words were thin, as if traveling through water. She fumbled for the parcel, but her hands met only cold boards. The air pressed close, thick and wet, carrying with it the faint scent of candle wax and Clara's perfume. She turned toward the smell. Clara? For a moment, there was the shape of a figure smaller than her, hair loose over her shoulders. Margaret reached out. Her fingers met something solid. Then the bell tolled again. Twice, the figure vanished. The parcel reappeared at her feet. The lock was open. Inside was not Clara's scarf, as she had placed before, but a small mirror, one she recognized from the Halloway dining room. In the reflection, she did not see her own face. The walls of the room pulsed once, as if breathing. The air thickened, the mist twisting inward until it coiled around the parcel like a living thing. Margaret snatched the mirror and stepped backward. "Not tonight," she whispered. She walked toward the door, refusing to glance at the shadows that shifted along the edges of her vision. When she crossed the threshold, the corridor was back. Harris stood there, pale lantern shaking. "You were gone," he said. "Longer than you think." They returned to the study. Margaret placed the mirror on the desk, covering it with a cloth. "We forced his hand," she said. "What do you mean?" Harris asked. "The hour's not theirs alone anymore." That night, no bell rang. The village lay in a silence so complete that even the dogs didn't bark. But in the morning, Every doorstep held a parcel. No ribbons, no notes. Inside each a single mirror, and in every mirror the same reflection: Hollowford Manor, the west wing window, and a pale figure watching from behind the glass. By now, the villagers were past fear. They began leaving in earnest, carts packed with what they could carry, heading for the roads beyond the moors. But the mist followed them. 2 days later, a cart returned, its driver missing. The only passenger was a parcel containing his driving cap. Margaret kept to the manor, mapping the times of the bell against the sightings in the mirrors. A pattern was emerging, but it was not one she could explain. The figure, sometimes Clara, sometimes another, moved between windows according to some hidden geometry. "If I can find the center," she told Harris, "I can break the circle. And if you can't, then we wait until it breaks us." On the 5th night, Margaret took the mirror from the parcel and set it on the study desk, uncovered. She sat before it, clock beside her, waiting. At precisely 1 minute past midnight, the figure in the reflection stepped away from the window and into the hall. Margaret stood. The hall behind her was empty. In the mirror it was not. The figure came closer, each step in the reflection bringing with it a faint, real sound on the study floor. The clock's ticking slowed, then stopped entirely. Margaret reached toward the glass. "Clara." The surface rippled. She felt a hand close around her wrist, cold, strong, pulling. Harris burst into the study as Margaret's other hand gripped the desk edge. The mirror was sucking inward, dragging her arm up to the elbow. He seized her shoulder, braced his feet, and hauled backward with all his strength. The grip on her wrist vanished. She stumbled into Harris, the mirror shattering on the floor. The air rushed out of the room as if a door had been opened somewhere deep in the manor. When the shards settled, none reflected the study. They all showed the same image: the box room, lit by a single lamp, with the parcel sitting exactly where Margaret had left it. The night after the mirror shattered, Hollowford felt wrong in a way no one could name. The mist came earlier, curling into doorways before sunset. The wind had no temperature, not warm, not cold, just empty. Margaret Vale did not leave the manor that day. Harris wanted her to. The villagers begged her to. She refused. "If I leave," she said, "the circle closes without me, and then no one will know what happened here." They set up in the study again, clock on the desk, lamp lit low. Margaret's notes lay in perfect order, though the ink on the newest pages had begun to fade, as if time itself were erasing them. "Whatever happens tonight," she told Harris, "you do not go into the West Wing. What makes you think I'd?" "Promise me." After a pause, he did. The first toll came at 11:50. Margaret stiffened. "It's early. Too early." The second toll followed 30 seconds later, and then the third. Outside, every door in the village slammed shut. Windows locked without hands touching them. Dogs whimpered in silence. The mist in the square rose until the church steeple disappeared. From somewhere deep in the manor, the sound of footsteps began, slow, even, coming closer. Harris gripped his lantern. "Where's it coming from?" Margaret's eyes were on the clock. The second hand wasn't moving. Everywhere. The footsteps reached the study door, but did not cross the threshold. Instead, the lamp flame stretched sideways, as if pulled toward the west wing. Margaret took the locked parcel from her satchel, the one she had refused to open. She set it on the desk. "They want this," she said, "so they'll follow it." She picked it up and walked into the hall. Harris followed despite his promise, his lantern trembling in his hand. As they neared the west wing, the air grew so thick it pressed on their ribs. The corridor bent in ways it hadn't before, leading them past doors that should not exist, windows opening onto rooms they had never seen. And with every step, the tolling continued, not once an hour, but over and over, until the sound filled every space inside their skulls. They reached the box room. It was not empty this time. Every missing person, the Halloways, the Carter, the others, stood along the walls, motionless, eyes open but unblinking. Clara was among them. Margaret stepped forward. Clara. Her sister's head turned toward her. The movement was slow, unnatural. You came back, Clara said. Her voice was wrong, too deep, too layered, like several voices speaking at once. I came to take you home. Clara smiled. This is home now. The tolling stopped. Silence. Then, from behind Clara, a shadow stepped forward. It had no features, no edges, only the suggestion of a man-shaped void in the lamplight. It raised one hand toward Margaret. Clara spoke again, the layered voices breaking into whispers. You can join us. Harris reached for Margaret's arm, but she stepped forward instead, placing the parcel on the floor between herself and the shadow. The lock clicked open on its own. Inside was not an object. It was darkness, thick, roiling, endless. The shadow bent over the box. So did Clara. So did all the others. Their faces sank into it, one by one, until nothing remained where they had stood. Margaret looked at Harris. Go. I'm not leaving without. Go. The shadow turned toward him. Harris fled. In the corridor, the mist was so dense he could see only the lantern glow in front of him. Behind him, the tolling began again, slow this time. 1, 2, 3. He didn't stop until he was outside, gasping in the cold night air. The manor loomed behind him, its windows dark. The tolling continued. On the 12th toll, every lamp in the village went out. By morning, Hollowford Manor was empty. Margaret Vale was never seen again. The parcels stopped appearing on doorsteps. But in the mirror above the Fox and Hounds bar, patrons sometimes swear they can see a tall woman in a long wool coat, standing in a hallway lined with doors that lead nowhere. And if you're foolish enough to look too long, you might hear it, a single low toll of a bell, meant only for you. Asterisk, some stories close with answers. This one closes with a door, one that's still open. And if you're ever in the north of England and the fog rolls in before sunset, remember Hollowford. Remember the hour that isn't an hour. And whatever you do, don't turn around when you hear the bell. Asterisk,